The Dragon's Return, Chapter 2, The Darkest Hour, Part 2. As soon as the feast was over, Arthur swept from the hall, practically running to the physician's chambers. It had been hours since Merlin had swooned right after his speech. Gawain had returned to the feast first, muttering to Arthur that Gaius had kicked him out, but Merlin had yet to wake. Lancelot returned an hour before the feast ended, also having been ousted by the physician. According to him, Merlin was sleeping soundly, but Gaius assured she would be fine. Arthur couldn't help but remember the last time Merlin had fallen at a feast. She'd been poisoned, or rather had drunk poison meant for him. She had nearly died. According to Gwen, both she and Gaius had thought Merlin had passed for a moment. He mounted the stairs and paused. There were voices coming from the other side. "For someone so gifted, such visions are not uncommon." That was Gaius's voice. The implication of his words had Arthur staggering slightly. He'd known for a while that Merlin was likely the last child of some bloodline wiped out by the Purge, but he hadn't been certain that she knew. A vision had forced her from consciousness? Could visions truly be so dangerous? Arthur found he'd taken a few physical steps back from the door and could no longer hear what they were saying. Careful not to make noise, he stepped back up to it. "What does it mean?" Merlin's voice was shaking. "I don't know. But if someone has torn the veil between worlds, then God's help us all," the old physician said, his voice shaking lightly. Arthur held his breath for a moment and took another before he knocked. Tonight was not the night to speak to her about whatever this was. Right now, he needed to make sure she was all right. The voices inside fell quiet for a moment. "It's open," Gaius called. Arthur pulled the door open and smiled as he spotted Merlin. She looked pale, more so than usual, and she was shivering even under the blanket she had wrapped around her. "Merlin, are you all right?" Arthur said, rushing over to her. She nodded, but her hands were icy as he took them. He rubbed them carefully between his hands to try and chafe some warmth back into her. "I'm all right, Arthur." Her voice was shaking. He couldn't tell if it was from the cold or not, except it wasn't cold in here. Sorry for being a bit of an interruption. "You have nothing to apologize for, Merlin. I'm sorry I couldn't come with you," Arthur said, leaning his forehead against hers. Even her face was cold. Arthur frowned. The night had been cool with autumn in the air, but not cold enough for this. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, and she nodded. But her eyes dipped away from his, a sure sign she wasn't being wholly truthful. He had thought that the coldest he would ever feel her skin was in that moment, but barely 3 days later he stared in horror at the ice crystals chiming in her hair. He could barely breathe. So many had been taken by the Daraka already, he could not let it continue. They had taken the light of his life. She was barely alive when they loaded her onto the horse, and still she begged to come with him. He would see her on the other side of this, one way or the other. He wished he'd had time to give her the seal that rested in his bag. He had planned to give it to her the night before they reached the Isle, to have Gawain and Lancelot keep her from following. The seal meant many things, but the biggest among them was that the crown would pass to her. His uncle, whom he'd left in charge, knew how he felt for Merlin, and Arthur knew she would be what was best for Camelot after he was gone. Agravain had no children of his own and had never married nor shown interest in it. Had he been given the opportunity to give it to her, it would have, by a few very old laws, been seen as a wedding, witnessed by the knights. She would become the de facto Princess Regent of Camelot. He would never get the chance now. He could only hope that Lancelot could get her back to Camelot. Maybe Gaius could help. The hope was a hollow one, he knew that. No one touched by the Daraka so far had lived. He would see her on the other side when he passed through the veil to close it. They bedded down in an old fortress 2 nights later, hoping that the fire they lit with what wood they had gathered would hold them over till morning.
"Did you hear that?"
Elian asked, and they all fell silent. Each of them feared the screech of the Daraka, but the roar of fire filled the silent night instead, and the flap of wings followed it. Arthur's heart swooped in hope. Dragon fire could burn solid stone. Maybe if they got lucky, it could get them to the Isle without anyone else dying. The sooner they reached the tear in the veil, the sooner he would see Merlin again.